dears, and welcome to another video. I'm so glad to have you, and happy spooky month, where both videos this month are going to be at least vaguely spooky themed. Also, for friends who need it right off the bat, I'm a white young person with light brown shoulder length curly hair. I'm wearing a black really long dress that you can't see, obviously. You can just see the black straps of it on the top. And I'm sitting in front of a plain wall that has green leaves on it. I thought about acquiring like a witch hat for this, but I work really hard on this hair. That wasn't worth it for the bit. As many of you know, I am a disability theater historian. That makes up a huge chunk of this channel. But in doing research for an offline project about a year ago, I started to have a lot of questions about the history of witches and whether there was any overlap between that and disability, because so much of early disability understandings find themselves rooted in the supernatural. And so I initially planned to make this video last October. I did all of the research for it, and then I was waiting for a specific publication to come out and a specific person to email me back, which ended up delaying it until this spooky season. None of that information really matters though, so let us dive in. Now, the first thing to know when diving into the history of witches is that literally nothing is clear-cut, and half the time the sources you read solely exist to contradict other sources you read. Like, most of the things that come up are angled towards debunking popular myths about the persecution of witches, and thus didn't give huge overarching histories, which was very overwhelming from a research perspective. But all of which to say, if some of this contradicts each other or doesn't match certain sources that you've seen, that's what's going on. That's just the situation at hand with this particular piece of history, and my bibliography is linked below as always. Also down below is my Patreon and the subscribe button and comment section. So if you feel so inclined to do any of those things, hit whatever buttons, please feel free to. Now, when we think about witch hunts, we imagine witch hunts being something that was really common in like medieval times, with the occasional fluke situation after that, like Salem, for example. But that's not really the case. We definitely see the occasional witch hunt in that time. They date back as early as the 10th century, but they didn't become somewhat common until the 1450s or so, and then ultimately gained significant momentum and died out by the mid-1700s. The rise in popularity in the mid-1400s was largely because the Christian church began to formally recognize the existence and harm caused by witches as influenced by Satan. And in 1484, Pope Innocent VIII made a decree that functionally authorized witch hunting. He did so at the request of an inquisitor named Heinrich Kramer, who a few years after would publish the Malleus Magnificarum, which gained significant popularity due to the printing press. The Malleus is often called the Witch Hunter's Bible. It's a sort of handbook on how to spot and torture confessions out of witches, but it wasn't necessarily the rule book that witch hunters followed to the letter, or like at all. Kramer was kind of a misogynistic mess, and a lot of people read the book and then just kind of ignored it because he was a misogynistic mess. And the book itself is kind of a sexist disaster. But either way, it's a really important historical text because to some extent it did shape how witch hunts would happen and give us a sort of idea of what people were at least looking for. Initially, cases of witchcraft were handled by the church rather than the state, but then there became laws around witchcraft, such as the Witchcraft Act of 1604 in England, for example. There were earlier ones in England, that's just like a very famous one, which created a legal way of hunting witches and definitely stoked the fire. Pun not intended. I'm so sorry, but I will note while we're here, most people accused of witchcraft were hung rather than burned, or they died under torture, because standard procedure at the time was to torture people until they confessed, which is a choice. We're not going to talk about torture methods here in this video. If that's something that you're interested in, feel free to head to my source list or do some Googling on your own. I like to keep things as trauma-informed on this channel as we possibly can. Popular discussions around this period of time today often call it the Burning Times and talk about how millions of people were killed for just being different. But it's important to note that it was most likely somewhere between 40,000 and 60,000 through Europe and its colonies, which is not an insignificant number, of course, but there is this sort of like semi-feminist view of witchery that finds legitimacy in sort of co-opting Holocaust imagery for use in a setting that's just not historically accurate. Kazro has a really great video about the situation. I will link it in the card above for you. It's also important to note that those accused of witchcraft were not always women. About 75 to 80% were, but many places like Russia, Estonia, Normandy, and Iceland had primarily male witches. A lot of Viking stories involve male sorcerers, and so we see this appear more commonly in places with Nordic history. Accusations of witchcraft often followed something like an outbreak of illness, a child death, weather that damaged crops, a man's impotence. They were really, really worried about impotence. The amount of sources that are just like, oh, the witches are out having orgies with the devil in the forest, that their primary concern is that. And there were also cases where men just wanted to make a name for themselves as a successful witch hunter here to protect the women and children, or like to make it seem like the devil is after them because they're so godly. And those who were accused were often those on the outskirts of society, so they didn't fit in with others. Perhaps they were a spinster, or they weren't particularly motherly and affectionate toward children. They didn't fit into societal and gender norms. It was also common to go after widows and people with large estates because if they were found guilty, their estates would then be forfeited to the government. So there was a little bit of incentive there. It's also important that I'm making the distinction between those accused of witchcraft and those who were witches, because witches as we think of them today did not exist back then. That's a relatively new concept, and being clear that these were just people who were persecuted on functionally false charges rather than like actual witches that were martyred for some cause or whatever is a very critical historical interpretation, because there is a massive difference in those two things. Witch hunts were also not a Christians trying to wipe out the pagans kind of thing. Pagan is a very massive umbrella term that refers to a whole lot of different things, and most witch hunts were Christians versus other Christians, though there were some cases of people practicing non-Christian religions being accused and tried for witchcraft. As you can probably tell by now, witch hunts were not a well-organized or standardized affair, and that makes the history of them absolutely impossible to generalize or widely encapsulate, because while there are some general wider trends that we see, there are also examples of just about everything you can think of that contradict that wider trend. So, you know, it is what it is. One pervasive thing that continues to pop up is this idea that it was midwives and herbal folk healers who were primarily at risk of accusation, and that this was the case because men were starting to realize that women's jobs could be profitable and wanted to take them over, which is two separate things. And both of them aren't quite the case. The first piece of that is that midwives and healers weren't at a wild amount of risk in comparison to other women. It's not like witch hunts existed solely to take down all midwives, particularly because midwives and healers were really important pieces in their community. And these people did engage in some risky things, like they knew a lot about the fertility problems of people. They had early access to infants, so would sometimes be accused as like the one who caused a birth to go wrong, for example. They had access to early drugs to minimize birth pain, which some saw as heresy against God's wishes, but they were also often used as experts in trials against accused witches and were often the ones responsible for searching for witches' marks on accused bodies. They were most at risk if they were the kind of midwife who was performing abortions, because the church had complicated opinions on the matter, as did many community members. Some historians have proposed that the witch hunts represented a concerted effort to drive women out of healthcare, and certainly this period shows a significant shift toward licensures and educated male practitioners. However, others have argued this campaign had less to do with gender than professionalization of the medical field. I also did read one article that noted that many herbal folk healers were unable to read and so would remember things via rhymes and songs, which may be the origins of the witch's spell as we think of it today. I think that's really cool. Early versions of the witch aesthetic, not quite as we think of it today, but the root of the one that we think of it today, are often traced back to an engraving from around 1500 by a German dude named Albrecht Dürer that depicts an old woman who is naked with wild, unkempt hair, riding backwards on a goat, holding onto a broomstick and screaming. Due to the rise of the printing press, this image would spread and become the standard for a lot of early witch imagery. Usually a woman, usually old, sometimes a young seductress, but usually more on the like old hag side, usually naked because witches were accused of having sex with the devil, usually flying and backwards, which are seen as against nature. Goats are involved because they signify the devil, or some other devil imagery like a pitchfork, long wild hair, screaming or shrieking. I haven't been able to find any sourcing linking that particular trait to stories of sirens, but I can't help but imagine there's definitely like a link there mythologically. And she also is often controlling the weather. The image usually includes some sign of work, be that a broomstick or a spindle or something along those lines. And in later iconography, more like what we think of today with like the conical hat and all of that, that began to appear in the 1700s, primarily beginning in Britain and then expanding outwards. Also, the idea of a witch being green did not appear until the Wizard of Oz film in 1939. That color is not mentioned at all in the original text. Abby Cox has a wonderful video tracing the origins of what we see as the traditional witch hat, which is likely in reference to a hat commonly associated with Quaker women who were seen as a direct threat to societal and gender norms, because in Quaker societies everybody is equal regardless of gender. They also didn't believe in paying tithes, which made them a direct threat to the patriarchy and the monarchy, and were often portrayed in media as deviant. There was also some time when George Fox, the founder of Quakerism, was suspected of being a sorcerer convincing people to become Quakers via magic. Anyway, early art of what witches' Sabbaths look like reflect what Quaker worship typically looks like, and a lot of coven-like imagery that we see is slightly reworked Quaker imagery. Abby Cox also noted that the tall pointed hat was sometimes associated with the Jewish faith in Germany and Italy, where they were required to wear distinguishing items of clothing at all times in the medieval era, but many of these hats don't look very much like witches' hats, and the modern witch image with the black hat that we think of today does derive from British popular culture, where satirical prints of women in black dresses, aprons, and flat-brimmed conical hats were a visual cue for Quaker women, so that is the more likely origin. But while we're here, I do want to touch on the anti-Semitism conversation because it's really important when we're talking about witches, and specifically the modern witch aesthetic. A lot of traits we see associated with witches, both visually and also in the sense of like behavior, were initially used to depict Jewish people before any witch associations, specifically with devil imagery and various accusations. Before witchcraft became a scapegoat for misfortune in Europe, it was Jews who were thought to be demonic and were said to poison wells, spread plague, and eat children. They were also often accused of the same crimes, such as heresy and being threatening to Christians just by existing. We also see an almost identical situation with the Romani people. This is not exclusive to the Jewish population. Also, some of the more modern anti-Semitic tropes begin to appear and become codified right around the time of the witch craze, with sanctioned Jewish ghettos appearing in the 1500s and Jewish people forced into certain professions that were then weaponized against them. The visual overlap between Jewishness and witches likely happened somewhat accidentally initially, like the idea of the long hooked nose to denote sin appeared in relation to Jewish men in the late 1200s, but long noses in women in media at the time primarily denoted old age rather than Jewishness. Jewish women were often portrayed in media either as the beautiful seductress or as the ugly old lady, which is, as you remember, also how witches were often portrayed, and so over time they started to kind of become shorthand for the same thing. As far as I've seen historians discuss it, it wasn't like, I will portray witches as I portray Jewish people because I don't like them. It sort of happened in two places at once and then combined over time as both stereotypes became more widely used and understood. Like a lot of racial stereotypes we have in the United States today happened the same way via vaudeville, where different larger stereotypes ended up being shorthanded as smaller traits that had large implications because of the cultural context behind them, and then were combined to create new meanings. So it seems very likely to me that probably the same sort of situation happened with witch imagery and Jewish imagery. But moving to the disability conversation, this is a very interesting era for disability because this is around the time when our more modern concept of disability begins to develop. We're seeing a legal codification of the deserving poor and the undeserving poor to define disability as the inability to work and to support oneself, not necessarily by impairment. Meaning that if somebody was impaired but able to work, which in this time was very, very common, they were not seen as the deserving poor who required support from the community and the state, which can make it difficult to historically trace disability because it wasn't of note unless it impeded somebody's ability to work, and often that information only appears in legal and medical texts. What fit into the realm of a typical body was a much larger category than it is today because physical difference was so common, and so it was generally left uncommented upon. Much of the legal literature at the time focused primarily on madness and not on physical difference because it just kind of wasn't that much of note. It doesn't matter as much as it does today. But that being said, an article I read had some specific examples of women accused of and executed for witchcraft that had all kinds of disabilities. As best I understand it, it seems kind of like it was less of a, this person is disabled, they must be a witch, and more, this person seems like a witch, also they have a disability. That is further proof of that, if that makes any sense. Much like we talked about earlier with midwives, it really only mattered when it mattered, otherwise it didn't really matter that much. Another example of this is the idea of the witch's mark, a birthmark, wart, freckle, or even just like general skin condition that was supposedly a place on one's body where the devil suckled from. And somebody having a birthmark didn't really matter in general, but once they were accused of witchcraft, part of the legal process for prosecution included the searching of that person's body for one of these witch's marks as further proof. Doctors and healers were very important in trials around witchcraft because they were viewed as the experts, and early Western medicine was very tightly tied with things like magic and astrology and the supernatural, and so it would be the doctor's job to diagnose whatever ailment was being used as evidence, both on the accused and on the so-called victim, and decide whether that was caused naturally and was like a medical condition, or if it was caused by the supernatural, like a curse or a spell. And there were times when doctors would say that the so-called victim was actually just experiencing madness or a drug-induced hallucination. It wasn't like they brought the doctor in and they immediately were like, ah, she's a witch. Like there are cases of them being like, oh no, this is a medical condition, she's probably not a witch, you're fine, don't worry about it, and everybody moved on. We also see disability language pop up a lot in the case of the Salem witch trials in particular, where we see it being utilized by both accusers and the confessors to both say, hey, that witch made me ill, so I'm a victim, and also we can tell she's a witch because she's in poor health, which really exemplifies how often things like disability only held societal meaning when and how it needed to hold meaning for a certain desired story to make sense. On the other side of the magical and spiritual disability realm from around this time, we also have the changeling tale, which are folk stories that we can find on nearly every continent that all tell some version of like, my child was replaced with that of a demon or a fairy, and in hindsight usually describe developmental disability. And they're often, at least in modern media, intertwined with the concept of witches. I wasn't able to find a lot of sourcing of that happening historically, but also the records of changing tales are very complicated and very difficult to track down in the first place, and that's part of the reason that this video got delayed. These stories are said to predate Christianity, but our best sources do appear in the Middle Ages. Also, the Brothers Grimm have a version of a changing tale in which they specify it is a legend rather than a fairy tale, suggesting that many adults still believed in these stories rather than them being like something only children believe, that's just a story. And we also still regularly use modern versions of the changeling tale. Much of the autism parent language is around autism stealing their child, and it's not all that dissimilar from early folk stories. Traits often associated with changelings include a child being ravenously hungry but unable to gain weight, appearing elfish or old or sickly or otherwise having odd physical characteristics, moving like they're possessed or otherwise odd, and having intelligence and behavior that don't match with their age, some things slower than typical and other things faster than typical. Modern analyses of some old folk stories have pointed out potential early descriptions of things like cerebral palsy, Williams syndrome, Down syndrome, progeria, autism, etc. And today we often associate changelings specifically with autism because the autistic community has somewhat embraced and reclaimed this concept, but it likely covered a very wide swath of things historically. Changeling tales come along with this idea that you can get the changeling out of your home and get them to replace it with the real child by doing something drastic, often leading to abuse and either unintentional or intentional filicide. One common example being leaving a baby outside overnight with the expectation that they would get swapped out overnight. Beatings, hot coals, and exorcisms were also not uncommon, but I will note that sometimes families would do all of these things to try to get rid of the changeling, and then if it wasn't effective, they'd give up and raise the child anyway. I think we have this view of the past where we're like, everybody was killing all the disabled children, but it was likely no more frequent than it is today, though it still is just unfortunately too frequent today. I also came across some literature around witchcraft and disability in the modern day, specifically in some regions of Africa where cultural beliefs around disability suggest that it is caused by witchcraft, and also suggest that disabled people themselves may practice witchcraft, particularly those who are more antisocial, which likely refers to autistic and mentally ill people. There are multiple references to demons and spirits as the cause of disability and about disabled people being viewed as potentially having magical powers and or being witches themselves, which often leads to the killing of disabled people. Now, I do want to acknowledge that to some extent these ideas had to be analyzed via and placed in a Western context for that research to exist. Both of the papers I read on this topic are by British people, so, you know, medical colonization is an issue. Though that article did acknowledge that some of this witchcraft disability problem does find its roots in anti-witchcraft laws that were initially introduced by British colonialism. I bring up this concept more because it's a modern connection between witchcraft and disability, which might suggest more historical connections between the two as well that are just more poorly documented. If this exists sociologically now, it probably existed sociologically back then as well. There is an interesting wider discussion to be had around cultural differences in disability interpretation, and not just in non-Western settings. There's like an interesting push-pull between honoring how something is culturally experienced and also acknowledging that it might be a clue for historical disability. A huge example being like prophets, for example, where we can both hold the fact that they heard the voice of God, and that is an important foundational piece of many religions, and the fact that somebody in that same situation today would probably be diagnosed and medicated for schizophrenia. Or how some cultures see having seizures as being possessed by a spirit and thus might reject any kind of epilepsy medication. And this conversation obviously gets very sketchy very quickly because it can be very hard to hold both pieces of this cultural belief is valid and should be respected, and there are treatments available for this thing that seems to be causing this person distress concurrently, especially if you're in a very Western medicine-centric mindset, because it is so oriented around the idea that deviance is something to be fixed. And also Western medicine tends to not be the most respectful of religious beliefs at times, and this is a pit that I find myself caught in often because I see folk stories, I immediately pull out very early diagnostic language, and I'm like, hey, you know, people like me existed here back then, but that often feels threatening to people who see the world through that folk storied lens, and so there is an interesting dichotomy there to pay attention to and to manage. And I very much wonder, like, what would happen if we put a bunch of physicians and theologists in a room and tried to reinterpret ancient texts through both of these lenses at the same time and see what holding these things concurrently could feasibly look like. The show The Chosen did that with one of their characters by making him autistic because there were some cues in the book of Matthew, I want to say. Was it Matthew? One of the characters in The Chosen, they were like, oh, you know, when he wrote his book, it's so specific about every single detail, and so they decided to make him canonically autistic in the show. And I thought that was super, super fascinating. I reviewed this character a while ago at the request of a religious friend. It's in my series somewhere. I also think this dichotomy is somewhat being held at the same time when we look at like Mad Pride, and specifically the Hearing Voices movement, and how it normalizes hearing voices and teaches people how to manage them rather than just shut them down altogether with medication, because not everybody wants that. There was also a recent anthropological study about how in some cultures, hearing voices is how people connect to ancestors, and they don't feel like they're overwhelming or that they're negative or like they need to treat them, which I think is really cool. That is an overall like scary and fascinating conversation I have offline with people literally all the time, because everybody has different opinions on it, and it's something that I have to navigate often in my line of work. And it's one of the reasons that I will always hold somebody's historical and cultural diagnosis as having equal weight and value as to what the modern equivalent of that would be, because that context matters as much as their list of described traits that we have historical information for. But going back to the idea of witchcraft, in the modern day we do still associate witches with disfigurement. The original witch in the Wizard of Oz book is described as being incredibly old and haggard and only having one eye, for example. Roald Dahl's The Witches are described as being clawed and disfigured. though as best I understand it, that book was more written to be unbelievably anti-Semitic than anything else. But as we talked about earlier, the merging of stereotype, right? Both things can be true at once. I would also argue that Elphaba from Wicked being green is a form of disfigurement, and that greenness is not attached to any of the races in Oz, so it would be sociopolitically categorized as a skin condition. And she also perfectly fits into the developmentally disabled changeling archetype that we discussed earlier. I've talked about this before on this channel. We're going to talk about it again next month when the second film comes out, and then I will make a new video. It's gonna be great. Other old and disfigured witches in media include the Hocus Pocus trio and many of the fairy tale witches in Disney films. Some of them, again, are both concurrently ableist and anti-Semitic. And while we're also speaking about Disney villains, while we're here, there's an interesting, like, queer witch overlap as well. We know as a result of the Hays Code, the queer coding villains is incredibly typical. It was a way to make gay characters appear on screen at all during censorship times, even if it meant making them the bad guy. And so we associate a lot of inherent queerness with being the bad guy, such as being unmarried and without children and doing things against the patriarchy and otherwise doing things against nature, such as magic, and caring a lot about appearance and like being like flamboyant and all that kind of stuff. And that's not that dissimilar from how witches were historically described as well, not to mention the inherent found family trope and the idea of a witch's coven. And so we read inherent queerness into witches today as well, which like isn't necessarily historically inaccurate, right? I actually think that there's something fun and almost reclamatory about acknowledging various forms of discrimination that existed in the times of witch hunts in the beloved witches we create today, because to some extent that sort of is our history as best we understand it, right? There's also been some historian suggestion that the F slur for gay people might find its origins in the bundles of sticks used to burn heretics during this era, though its use in that particular slur sense may be a lot more recent. The TV show adaptation of A Kind of Spark also makes really interesting choices around autism and witchcraft, where a girl struggles to fit into the social norms and feels compelled to stim, and after hearing everybody talk about there being witches among them who are making things go wrong, she begins to wonder if she might be a witch, which is actually something that happened historically. There were times when people would come forward thinking perhaps they'd cursed somebody by accident and they would give themselves up, though it wasn't incredibly common. I think this idea to connect witchery with the unnatural in a narrative sense is also interesting because modern day people who refer to themselves as witches usually engage in witchcraft as a way to connect with nature. Modern day witches also tend to be largely queer, trans, and disabled, so there might be something to do with that. But anyway, I wish that I had more to tell you about on this topic. That's kind of all that I was able to concretely find. Reading about this felt like I was trying to read through fog, but I hope that you learned something today, maybe have begun to think about the history of witches a little bit differently. I would again really recommend that Kazro video I mentioned earlier. There are theses around how like humans are always going to human, and the issues with the capitalist co-opting and sort of like weird girl bossification martyrdom of witchcraft are really great, and they're done so well that I decided to not include them in this video. So please go check that video out. Again, all sources are linked below if you want to learn anything more about this topic. And in the meantime, thank you for being here. Thank you for being. Remember, critical thinking is really sexy, and I look forward to seeing you, my dear, in the next one.